You know that after David's reign and Solomon's reign, the 10 northern tribes split off and became what the Bible calls Israel. Instead of all Israel being together, we have the northern tribes that was called Israel, and then Judah and Benjamin and some of the Levites, they stayed in the southern part, and they were known as Judah. Why was Israel taken off into captivity in Assyria? Well, they built their own golden calves. They started falling into idolatry. They made their own dates for the feast days. They completely went away from Torah. And because of that, Yah punished them, just like he said he would in Deuteronomy 28, and they were taken off by the Assyrians and placed into captivity. Now, after their captivity, they were dispersed throughout various nations. Hosea 9 verse 3 says, they shall not dwell in Yah's land, but Ephraim. Ephraim also is another name for Israel, the northern tribes. Ephraim shall return to Egypt and shall eat unclean things in Assyria. Again, Egypt there is not necessarily the nation of Egypt. It could also just be a condition of slavery and exile. But let's say we take it literally, Egypt. Where were Israelites sent? To Egypt, which is in Africa. Assyria, also, we saw that Assyria was founded by Nimrod, a descendant of Ham, a black nation. So they were dispersed. But they went all over, and I don't have time to go into how we know everywhere that they went, but they were dispersed through many nations. Here is just an ancient depiction of the Assyrians whipping the Hebrews. I don't know why, just stiff-necked. They always call them stiff-necked. Just never learned their lesson. Here they are. And what year was it? 701 BC getting whipped. And still, you go to, the 1800s, still being whipped. Hard-headed, stiff-necked. But the Hebrews, by the way, are those men to the right with their arms stretched out. And if you were close enough, you could see that they have afros and coarse beards. Those are what the Hebrews look like in 701 BC. All right, Isaiah 66 and verse 19 says, I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, that draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. Just give me a minute to tell you who these various nations were. Tarshish, Pul, Lud, Tubal, and Javan. I'm not going to read all this, but I'm just going to tell you that Tarshish is another name for Carthage, which is a North African nation. Let me go back to the one we just looking at. Javan is another word for Greece, actually, which is right there in the Mediterranean Sea. Lud is a name for Turkey. And by the way, they say that the sons of Shem actually dwelt in that area previously. Or if it's not Turkey, then they say it's an African people of Egyptian origin that were accustomed to fighting with bows and arrows. That's what I'm getting from historical sources. When it says Lud, it's either Turkey or it's a bunch of African folks. I don't know how it can be both, but I'm just, the messenger. Tubal, they don't know. They say it could be the Spanish, it could be the Italians, it could be Asia Minor, Anatolia. They don't really know. And what else am I missing? Pul is an African nation, an island in the Nile between Egypt and Ethiopia. So again, a number of, they're all over. Sent to the Mediterranean, sent to Africa, maybe as far as Spain and Italy. And those of us who traveled to those places, you will see some very dark people, especially in Italy. They're right there. very dark-skinned people. And in fact, I will tell you, I went to Italy, and we were taking a tour of a medieval town, and there was this huge mansion. They were talking about this family that had once reigned over this medieval town. And on the outside of the building was carved in stone an insignia of the family. And it was indisputably a black man's head. I mean, curly afro, everything. I mean, indisputably. And I said to my tour guide, I said, why is there a black person on a medieval building in Italy? And he's like, oh, well, you know, they were darker, and so they... Darker. He wouldn't say they were black. But it was literally the head of a black man. So it could be Israelites were sent as far as to Italy and to Spain. So I'm going to skip through all of this. But I just want you to see, I pulled this right from blueletterbible.org, and you see Pull, an island in the Nile, Lud, one sprung from Shem, one from Ethiopian, Egyptian origin, Tubal, they don't know, Javan, Greece, we do know that. All right, so the 10 northern tribes were dispersed throughout basically sea territories, includes nations on the African continent, and many cities that were founded by black Hamites. That's where the nations of, or the people of Israel were dispersed. Now, Judah was also sent into captivity. They didn't learn their lesson. They should have watched what happened to Israel and said, okay, we're going to keep Torah, we're going to obey. But I can't remember which prophet said it. They actually took it even further than Israel had, very sadly. And so they, too, were taken off into Babylon to be captive. And let me just pause. I didn't have this in my notes, but I want you, when you read the Bible, to notice how their captivity was. Yes, they were oppressed, they were suffering, but a lot of times they still held very high positions. You know, they were in the king's court. Not all of them were oppressed the way we see how we're being treated now in these faraway lands. I mean, so yes, they were in captivity. They couldn't go in their land. They couldn't always obey their own laws. But there's a level of captivity, the one that we saw in Deuteronomy 28, that level of cursing that I don't even think they had attained yet in the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities. But anyhow, we know that after the Babylonian captivity, some remained in Babylon, some were sent to Arabia, some into Persia, Egypt, and other African nations. We know that there was a dispersion by Scripture. On the day of Pentecost, right there in Acts chapter 2, it tells you that there were Jews who had come to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. And Acts chapter 2 and verse 11 tells you where these Jews came from. They came from Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, Cyrene, strangers of Rome, both Jews and proselytes. Proselytes were, can you explain proselytes again? It's just Jews who were kind of living like Greeks. So when you see proselytes there, it's really just another type of Jew, but they're Jews. So where did they come from? Some of them from Egypt in Africa, some of them Libya in Africa, and some of them Cyrene, which we'll talk about in a minute. All these people were Jews, but they had already been dispersed right after the time of Messiah. We also know about Apollos. Now, Apollos, we learn in Acts 18, verse 24, that he was a Jew born in Alexandria. Alexandria is a great city in Egypt. It was like almost like a haven for Jews during this time, because in many parts of the ancient world, Jews were mistreated. They were like the lowliest caste, but in Alexandria, they had their own little quarters. They could attain political office and that sort of thing. And Apollos, who was one of the main evangelists of the early church, he was from Alexandria. He was an Egyptian Jew, essentially. And he preached at Corinth, and there was such a rivalry amongst the followers of Apollo and the followers of Paul that Paul had to write about, like, look, neither of us is Messiah, so stop tripping, right? But Apollos was that influential. There were also a number of evangelists in the early church from the city of Cyrene. Cyrene was a Greek colony in present-day Libya. But we know for a fact that many Jews lived in Cyrene. So Cyrene, again, is in Libya. There were lots of Jews there. And the Jews in Cyrene were the lowest caste. They had like 4 different classes, and the Jews were the lowest of the classes. And throughout Acts, there's mention of these evangelists and teachers of the faith that came from Cyrene. So we have Africans, or Jews who are living in Africa or from Africa, playing a major part in the early church. I'm not going to read all of those. Well, let me read Acts 13, verse 1. It says, "Now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger." Niger means black. That's all it means. "And Lucius of Cyrene," like we said, a North African city, "and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul." We see there clearly we have Jews from African nations very active in the early church. And then Simon of Cyrene is mentioned in Matthew 27, verse 32. "As they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, an African, or a Jew dwelling in Africa, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross." Now, just about every Hollywood movie about the crucifixion makes a big to-do about Simon. He'll be the one black man in the whole movie. And he carries the cross of Messiah when he gets too weak. Even they admit. How did they know I always wondered, how did they know he was black? Because he was from Cyrene in Africa. So, again, lots of early church fathers, whatever you want to call them, that were Jews from African nation. I'm just trying to prove to you that the Jews had been dispersed, even at this time, throughout African territories. Okay, there's other proof in historical record that's not necessarily in Scripture, but there's other proof that the Jews had been dispersed throughout Africa. So give me one moment. Now, some say that the kingdom of Ghana actually was founded by Jews. Some historians say that starting in about 300 AD, the kingdom of Ghana began to be ruled by a dynasty of Jewish kings known as the Zah dynasty. The founder of the dynasty was a man named Zah el-Yemeni, who was descended from Jews of Yemen. He established his capital city at Gao on the Niger River in what is now known as the nation of Mali. And we have Arab historians from the 9th century, one called Al-Yaqubi, who say that there's a kingdom, the greatest of this area, the most important and the most powerful. All the kingdoms in this territory obey this king. Okay, so we have Arab historians, we even have some European historians. It was rich in gold and iron. Also, remember I mentioned Eldad the Danite? He's a famous Algerian Jewish author. This is the one that said, okay, the Ethiopian Jews are definitely of Israelite origin, all that stuff. Well, he said that the original kingdom of Ghana was started by Jews as well. So I never knew that before. But for it to be established there, right there in West Africa, we're talking about 380. So for a long time, there was a Jewish presence in West Africa.